I think it's this collision of, for example, the esoteric and the hard sciences, the indigenous wisdom meeting now Western research practices. It's the Eastern understanding of mindfulness versus what's emerging now in Western cultures. They all have their different qualities, but I think it's in this collision that something else is created. And I think this is where coaching emerged, because coaching is a relatively new form of practice. But I think you're right. There is a lineage, and there are traditions, and Jonathan Passmore, for example, a big thought leader in coaching, he recently argued that, look, some form of coaching conversations have been happening in the caves. It's not just something that started in the 1980s at McKinsey with Sir John Whitmore. It's actually holding space for people to help them learn and figure something out. At the core, this meeting of people, of two people sitting in a room together, or a group of people sitting in a room together and really connecting. And in that context of connection and relationship, there's certain practices, there's certain lines of inquiry, there's certain methodologies or questions that we can ask that help somebody really develop and move forward. I think it's in that space where we meet that something new happens. And I think that's where we're at. We're still trying to figure out what coaching is in the context of psychedelics. So I don't know if there's a question in there. Probably is.
No, I mean, what comes to mind for me there is also just the parallels in terms of spiritual traditions, right? So there's a class that I teach at Fluence, and various papers we look at, and one of them, from the 80s, a guy named John Wellwood, who coined the term spiritual bypassing. He is a Buddhist practitioner, and he's also a psychotherapist. And he looks at some of the parallels and the differences between psychotherapy on the one hand. He's not talking about psychedelics explicitly in this paper, but more about psychotherapy versus meditation and spiritual practice, and where the lines and the boundaries between one end and the other begins. And there's an interesting part where he talks about how it's not so difficult to get someone's ego, and this is the language of the time, but like a little dismantled or disrupted, right? Again, using non-ordinary state practices. But it's a much bigger responsibility to be able to, or a much bigger challenge to be able to support someone through a process after the fact. And the interesting thing is he's alluding to the responsibility of a spiritual relationship, right? And arguing that maybe that's not appropriate for a transactional or a therapeutic relationship that is ultimately transactional, right? And I'm reading this thinking he's describing psychedelic integration, or what's required for solid psychedelic integration support. And he's also saying that that's not appropriate for therapy. And when I'm teaching this class with a bunch of therapists, they're all like, well, so is where does my role as a therapist begin and end? Also, if you're able to get through some obvious sort of points of stuckness of clinical conditions, right? If someone's able to get out of depression into anxiety, manages the anxiety, you're moved through addiction issues, and you're over and you have some relative equilibrium, and then you're really reckoning with some bigger questions about who you are, what the hell is going on in the world. Questions that aren't aren't necessarily, the scope of therapeutic practice. And I'm not saying these are the scope of coaching practice either, but things get a lot more complex. And you do have a lot of folks who are, and I suspect a lot of them are do have or could benefit from relationships with coaches where they're not necessarily super depressed or anxious or addicted, except to their phones, which is a real problem. But they could really use some support in terms of continuing to orient themselves in the world, in their relationships, and in their values, and their frameworks for like reality. It's really interesting, fertile territory when you start to get there. And I'm almost more interested in, like, what you're saying is making me more interested in the relationship between, coaching per se and what, historically, I guess, would have existed in the context of, community, like relationship and like spirituality. Those people that are coaching each other in caves, they're both priests or shamans in their cave painting tradition. One of them's got a bear pelt on the head, right? So,
maybe.
Did that for 20,000 years before we started writing anything down.
Well, it's dialogue essentially, right? And I think these questions that you kind of touched on, what the hell is this? What am I doing here? I don't know. What legacy do I want to leave? Or what's going on in the world? What should I do with my time? What's the purpose of living? What's the meaning of all this? There's so many big questions that are very personal, and some of them very individual, some of them very systemic. But these are questions that don't necessarily mean you're suffering or you have a pathology. It's just they're big questions and a space to explore those questions. And these questions don't have one answer. So we can't educate somebody on it. But I think a good educator will hold a space that will maybe offer a question, or they will maybe point out the question that's already in the room. But, often there's a question, but the person who's asking the question aren't aware that they're asking the question. And somebody who's skilled in listening, they can pick up that there is a question and put the question on the table so that that person can actually try and figure that out without having to know the answer. Peter Hawkins says it so beautifully. He says that a coach and a client, they walk together to a learning edge where neither they nor I have the answer, but we both acknowledge that life requires us to find an answer right now. And so we're doing work together. What's the work that we're required to do here? And I think, again, that sets for me coaching apart from therapy, because it's not a healing modality. And for me, in the psychedelic space particularly, it seems that the majority of people have come, and probably still do come, for some form of healing to psychedelics, because that's in the public eye at the moment. That's where the research is focused on. But I reckon there's way more people that have not healing intentions, but these kind of more existential questions that could really benefit from dialogue, and that dialogue could really benefit from a psychedelic experience that can elicit some of those questions, or maybe help us tap into something where we could synthesize an answer from.
And I think it's also that it could prevent a later therapy if people do more work in a coaching or whatever realm you will call it, but to prevent things, because they already gain these insights that help them in so far so that they don't run into problems later on. So I think I think it's important that there is such a big light shining now on research for therapy to make it more legal. But I think it's still, there's a big need in more research in people who are healthy in a way, but have their issues or topics, and you can work with, and to see how to prevent actually diagnosis, because also diagnosis in the end can help somebody or it can make it worse. So that's sometimes also why I think the intake of a coach can help somebody who has a diagnosis sometimes more than somebody who is a therapist, because leaving out the word diagnosis or the symptoms and just being there with the person and meeting the person at where she is just sometimes much more helpful than being in a therapist-client relationship in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, and I'm not a huge fan of specific, diagnoses. They have their utility, but they also definitely have their limits and can certainly harm. I think like there's a lot of use cases, in terms of the healing question. Uh, there are lots of folks who think they're doing just fine and who have a psychedelic experience and then realize that they need therapy, or that they could benefit from therapy. That definitely happens. But maybe to speak to the broader point, there's also an ironically unhealthy obsession with healing and getting to the bottom of all our trauma. And I think there's more awareness around this now, but certainly that's been